A chance that your perspective of what ministry success is will change.
What am I going to do? Not answer his text message while we're on a plane? I like to say a spiritual director is kind of like a therapist for the soul.
Hey, Rethinkers, welcome back to the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. We are so excited that you are starting your year off with us. I would love for you to meet who we have here today on our podcast, because some of these folks are my really good friends. Like Jenny, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, of course. Hi, friends. My name is Jenny. I am the youth pastor at Gainesville First United Methodist Church, which is in a tiny little town just north of Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm not only the youth pastor, I am a lot more. Should I dive into that now?
I mean, We'll get to all your jobs,
okay.
Because I think that will resonate with a lot of our listeners that you wear more than one hat. Or is it other duties as assigned?
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think for now, my official title is Youth and Young Adults Pastor.
My name is Shane Sanchez. I'm a part of the Orange Students team. I'm involved in a lot of different things that we do here, but also have, I think it's now 16 years of youth ministry experience, volunteer, vocational, everything in between. So, yeah.
Hey, y'all, I'm Kristen Vincent. I am a spiritual director. I teach the Enneagram, and I do a lot of work with clergy. I do a lot of spiritual formation stuff with clergy, both individual and group spiritual direction, retreats, again, Enneagram stuff, both clergy and pastoral staff. So I'm so excited to get to be here with y'all today and check all this out.
And friends, if you're listening and you're like, what in the world is spiritual director? We are going to get to that right after Ryan tells us a little bit about himself.
I love spiritual direction. It's so good. My name is Ryan Pennington. I'm the student ministry pastor at First Baptist Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I've been in paid ministry for 10 years, full-time student ministry pastor for 7 years. I love Nebraska sports. Go Big Red, baby. I love my wife, and I love my cat, Gigi.
You have a cat. We love that.
That's
I
awesome.
love cats are the best.
This conversation is the setup for a great joke. A
Oh,
Baptist, a couple Methodists, a raised Pentecostal and non-denominational, and a spiritual director all walk into a bar. Well, it wouldn't be a bar, actually. It would, yeah. Oh, yeah, this should be good. We need to play this out more.
Nice.
Sorry.
Well, for the Methodists, it would be a bar.
Yes.
I just noticed it. Sorry.
That's actually really
That's great.
Well, I wanted to gather all of you here today around this table for this podcast because as a youth worker of many years, I have experienced a very burned out season in my life where I felt all I did was work for God and I was never with God. And I believe that pressure to constantly perform in youth ministry is bigger today than it's ever been. And I'm just wondering, is this even a big deal, right? Should we be talking about our spiritual health as youth workers and people who serve students and families? Because at the end of the day, if your youth ministry is successful, you have students attending, worship is great, your retreats are full, does your spiritual health matter when you're leading if you're performing well and everything is going well? I don't know. I think it's a tension for me. I heard Francis Chan talk about this one time, that he could have packed the church out regardless of how he personally was with God. And I have felt that.
Yeah.
So tell me, does it matter? Does your spiritual health matter if you are running a successful ministry?
I would say so. But again, I'm a spiritual director.
So tell us more.
Biased.
Let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
First of all, can you define for us what a spiritual director is?
Sure. So I like to say a spiritual director is kind of like a therapist for the soul. So in spiritual direction, somebody will come to me and they'll talk to me as if they're in therapy. So you're just talking about your life, whatever it is that's coming up for you. But instead of trying to diagnose you or fix you, what I'm trying to do is listen very deeply to what is sort of going on below the surface spiritually, and to listen for the spiritual questions that may be coming up, the spiritual needs, the ways in which people are really yearning for God, but they don't have a name for that yet. And also listening for the ways in which God may be showing up for them and they just haven't noticed it yet.
Yeah.
We talk about spiritual practices. We talk about when they're angry at God, when they're not feeling God's presence, when God feels really far away, when they're mad at the church. We talk about kind of the gamut.
Wow.
So what happens when, as a youth worker, you're dangerously tired and we don't have anyone to plug into, like a spiritual director? Or Ryan, you recently experienced a sabbatical, which, hallelujah that you were gifted a sabbatical, because I would say 20 years in youth ministry, I've never been gifted one.
Yeah.
And so can you tell us a little bit about your renewal leave and what that was like?
Yeah, first of all, praise God from whom all blessings flow for getting a sabbatical. Come on. It really was a gift in all sorts of ways. I just learned, like, what I loved in my sabbatical was that I got to relearn how beautiful ordinary things were. Like, I wasn't enjoying just the simple daily rhythms of everyday life when I'm in high speed paid ministry sort of work. And so on sabbatical, just getting every day to kind of like rediscover what does life with God look like in just ordinary things and boring things and a slowed down day, just being in my backyard, like just looking up at a tree, just enjoying the sun, being with my cat outside, enjoying a cup of coffee. And I think that was a huge thing is just in general, relearning how to be with Jesus outside of the meaningful work of paid ministry.
That's good.
So that was a big thing for me. Yeah.
Wow. That's good.
Charlie, I want to go back to your original question. Like, can you take time for yourself if everything in your ministry is going well?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is you have to. You cannot lead others if you're not leading yourself. And I think that is our greatest, truly the greatest hindrance, maybe the greatest stumbling block that anyone in ministry is facing, anyone in leadership, anyone in power, anyone that has the opportunity to shepherd and walk alongside young people, is if we are not first leading ourselves, we can't lead anyone else anywhere.
Yeah.
Except to a place where we are leading ourselves to.
Yeah.
And so if we are leading ourselves to a place of just complete and utter stress or anxiety or tiredness, then that's where we're going to be leading our people to as well. To a place of superficiality, to a place of running ourselves down, then that's where we're going to be leading our people to. And so despite the appearances that we might be producing something other than what it might be in our souls, eventually the fruit that's within ourselves will be produced on the outside, what's becoming inside of us. And so, really for anyone who's like, well, I don't need to rest, or I don't need to be leading myself to be taking care of myself because everything is looking good. If you look on the outside, it looks fine. Eventually, trust me, we have plenty of people all around us. We have plenty of people on social media, plenty of people who have gone before us, who have shown us what that fruit in our lives produces when we do not first lead ourselves to a place of something of care in our lives, just something of greater importance in our lives if we're not first taking care of ourselves.
That's good.
Shane, you served in some pretty big ministries.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you've had permission to take care of yourself? Because I felt like you've worked in places where the pressure was intense.
I mean, yeah, I think pressure is intense anywhere. I do understand, the unique nature of some of the contexts in which I've led. I felt rhetorical permission, but I was never necessarily led to take advantage of that. Like, I really do feel like we would say the things, and I felt empowered by words to do that. But at the end of the day, I don't know if that's me. I don't know if that was the culture that I was in. I don't know if that's even just being a part of, Western civilization and American culture where like we don't feel like we can ever stop, and to succeed is to always be running. And especially, and I can say this to leaders who are in larger church context, especially in those contexts, because I don't know if I should say this, but so much of that drive mirrors American consumerism and the push for more, bigger is better.
Yes.
So that was always exhausting. I can tell you, when I think I became aware of the fact that I was running on empty, one of the times. But I remember it was a baptism service with students, and those are always like emotional, you know, especially we had some really cool produced environments. So maybe that even added, turned the dial up a little bit on that. But I remember watching students be baptized. I was about to preach and feeling completely numb. And I felt guilty about that, because as a youth pastor, you're supposed to be in tears or be like ecstatic. And I was happy for them.
These are your students. Like that should have warmed your heart.
100%.
Yeah.
And it like, it warmed my head, which sounds terrible. That sounds like a fever, but it was not a fever dream. But it warmed my mind. Like I was like, yeah, absolutely. But my heart and my soul, as we were talking about earlier, I just was left there wondering, like, what is going on? This is odd. And that was definitely an indication of like, I needed some rest. I needed some silence, some solitude, and just a different pace. But
silence and solitude make me break out in hives.
Fair enough.
It was a spiritual practice for me that I've had to work on, and I'm still terrible at it. In fact, when I take a day of silence, I make a to-do list to break up the day. One, I have ADHD, but two, it's a spiritual practice that I have to work at.
yeah.
But I do believe it needs to be one.
Yeah.
I'm just terrible at it.
Well, you just said that you told me earlier that you're an 8 on the Enneagram,
Yes.
and so that's going to play into it. 8s are going to have a really hard time with silence and solitude, because 8s want to be on the go, in control, defended, and silence and solitude is absolutely about vulnerability,
Yeah.
and so that's not going to come easy or natural to you. So there's a way to look at spiritual practices that will work, but I think what you guys are sort of speaking to is, Jenny, you used a really important word. You talked about producing. And I think, from what I know from the work that y'all do, there is an emphasis on producing, producing results, producing big groups of kids, lots of engagement, producing curriculum, producing events, all of this stuff. So the emphasis is on production, and that's not what's going to feed your soul, right? That's what's going to feed the needs of the church on the surface level, but it's not what's going to feed the soul. And one of my favorite verses in Scripture is Psalm 42:7, deep calls to deep. And I like it enough that I have it tattooed on my arm. And I think of it in terms of big D, deep, calls to little d, deep, right? So God is calling to us, to the deepest part of us. And we're calling back to that big D, deep. Like it's just a constant revolution. And in doing that, there's no producing involved. It is a letting go. It is sitting and, enjoying the sunrise and petting your cat and, drinking the coffee and just being, right? Just being.
Yep.
And it's learning spiritual practices where you're just being and just letting go and being silent, even though that doesn't sound great, right? But I think that's the invitation, and I don't think that's talked about enough.
Yeah.
That's so true.
No, and I love that, like, the beauty of doing that over and over and over again is you learn that that's actually like the greatest gift. Like that is the reward.
Yeah.
Is just to sit in God's presence, and then all of those other things that we often chase after in paid ministry, like the affirmation, the numbers, getting bragged on by our lead pastor, getting a raise, getting more social media followers on our student ministry page. whatever, like those things just become insignificant, and you find yourself just craving that time with Jesus and the stillness and in the quiet. And that just leads like everything that you do in your ministry. And man, it took me way too long to even figure that out.
Yeah.
Ryan, with your time away and what you've been learning through your sabbatical and your journey, tell us, can you just share with our listeners what has been the most practical, as someone who is in an active ministry role, what has been the most practical spiritual discipline that you've experienced or that seems to be working best for your context?
Yeah. I'll start with a John Mark Comer quote, because we have to in this conversation. I have to quote John Mark Comer, and one of his kind of like little books. It's just called How to Spend a Day with Jesus. There's this profound statement where he's talking about how the goal isn't to go away to a monastery. And the irony is, I'm reading this while I'm at a monastery on sabbatical. Like, I'm at a monastery, and he's saying the goal is not to go away to a monastery to achieve this stillness or this witness with God, but the goal is to experience that in the chaos of the city, in your everyday, like, nooks and crannies of your life. And so I think that's a perfect quote for your question, because the ordinary, normal, daily person, we often like react with extremes. Like, if we're able to identify that, like, man, I am addicted to social media, we react by just getting rid of social media, and then we let everyone know about it. But the goal is, how can we actually just have like daily, simple, ordinary rhythms that are planned into our day, no matter who you are, what your job is, how old you are, so we don't constantly have to react with extremes and just get rid of things all the time. And so the answer to your question, honestly, is prayer. My first piece of advice for anyone, even teenagers, is develop a prayer rhythm, a daily prayer rhythm, whatever that might look like. If it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, but start experimenting, explore with some different prayer practices. And that also starts with teaching people different prayer practices, and not just sticking within your tradition of your church, or just assuming, that prayer is just saying whatever you want, however you want, because that could also be kind of like anxiety inducing for teenagers. If you just say, just pray however you want.
Yeah.
But it's actually like so helpful to provide some guidance, some guardrails, some different traditions and practices. So that's my number one tip, is develop a daily prayer rhythm, experiment, explore. God will meet you there.
That's good.
Really good.
Yeah, I love that, that you're emphasizing experiment and explore, because I do think that it's about finding what works for you, and what the invitations are for you. God is inviting each of us in different ways. And so I think the idea of just paying attention to what resonates for you, what delights you, what speaks to you, where it is that you sort of feel, most connected with God. I think those are the invitations to your spiritual practices.
Yeah.
Jenny, you have a lot of jobs at your church. So you're in charge of young adults and middle school
and high school
ministry and modern worship responsibilities in the worship service.
In the worship service, yeah.
Parent ministry.
And then I help. So yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff. So I do student. So I first came on as a young adult minister. And then our student ministry went through a transition from 3 people down to no people. And so I stepped in to help with the transition. And then you know how that goes. And so I became the person that took over student ministry, but was the sole person continuing on my position with young adults. And then I continued on with my modern worship responsibilities of being the sole pastoral presence in that position. After our pastor leaves that service to go continue preaching in the other services. And then I also have an inclusive, adaptive hiking ministry that I lead at our church. And then I help with the parenting ministry at the church. And so, yeah, it's just the whole gambit. It's a lot. But I love every second of it.
Okay.
That's the whole thing, right?
You
like
love
we
it.
love what
Yes.
we do.
Yes.
That's the hard part.
Yes.
And yet,
what is the desire and longings in your heart right now?
Yeah. So, thanks to really good self-awareness that I've developed from my counselor and from just people who love me really well, I've walked through seasons where I've not had good boundaries in my self-care routine and in the boundaries that I have and how I work. You talk about that situation that you had, Shane, where you felt numb watching kids say yes to Jesus. And you're like, oh my goodness, this is literally the biggest day in their life. And I don't feel anything. For me, it was this moment where my hands got numb and my face got numb. And I called my doctor being like, oh, what is going on? I think I'm having a reaction to my medicine. And he was like, I think you're just not breathing.
Wow.
And
Holy
lo
cow.
and behold, that was it. I was just carrying a lot of heavy stuff with students. And it was heavy stuff with students. It was back to school season. I was going through seminary as well. So it was just like a lot of things on my shoulders all at once. And I realized, like, man, yeah, you're right. I'm probably just not engaging in some really good breathing practices. And I have been working 7 days straight, not intentionally. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And as much as we love to try to intentionally plan vacation, even this past weekend, I went to see a friend and I had a student text me and he was having a little bit of a struggle with some mental health thoughts. And what am I going to do? Not answer his text message while we're on a plane?
Yeah.
Like that's just the way that our job rolls.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yet we live in this tension, right? We can't sacrifice our souls on the altar of ministry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can't sacrifice our families
Yeah.
on the altar of ministry. We can't sacrifice our friendships on the altar of ministry.
Yep.
And so how do we live into that tension?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's been bringing people into my life and into my inner circles who can be like, hey, Jenny, when was the last time you had a day off?
Yep.
Hey, I know that a lot of my stuff is on the weekends.
Yeah.
Jenny, when was the last time that you had a Saturday off?
Right.
And like, unfortunately, some of you guys listening probably work in offices where not everyone in your office understands that you don't work a 9 to 5. And
Because ministry is weird.
Because ministry is weird.
Yes.
And Tuesdays for me is one of those kind of days where I just don't even try to clock my hours because it's not going to add up.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't want to know what it adds up to because I'm scared to know what it adds up to. You know how it is? Like I have a devotional that I lead students in at 7 a.m. on Tuesday mornings. We have 70 to 80 students show up every Tuesday morning for this 7 a.m. devotional. And then on Tuesday nights, I lead a Tuesday night small group with young adults. So from 7 a.m. to I don't finish until about 9 p.m. on Tuesdays.
Yeah.
That's my Tuesdays.
Yeah.
But the people in my church office, I mean, my pastoral team understand it, but the average worker in my office does not understand that. So, there's just certain things that you just can't always add up everything.
Right.
So mentally, I'm always going, okay, even just getting away from my desk.
Yes.
Walking around the church building, walking around the parking lot, doing things to remind myself at the end of the day, yes, I'm walking through heavy things with students. Yes, I'm building bridges to Jesus. Yes, I'm walking with students through some pivotal moments in their lives, but I am not the key ingredient to their
that's
salvation
good.
story.
Yeah.
Really good. That's really good. Shane, I have a question for you. Male in ministry, 8 on the Enneagram. Do you find as a man that this internal work is harder?
I don't know. There's a few things kind of stirring through my heart and mind right now. I want to answer your question, but I want to follow up something that Jenny said too. So there's something I want to acknowledge that I think will be liberating to a lot of people listening. The reality is, youth ministry leaders are most likely the hardest workers in their church. And if you're not,
Listen, some kids pastors are going to
I
come
know,
egg your house right now.
I know.
Like, holy cow.
I'm not saying that kids pastors don't work hard, but the mental emotional and spiritual load of a youth pastor is dynamically unique within the context of a church.
I agree.
And the reason why I wanted to say that out loud is because even of like the reactions that we had around the table is because it's like we're almost like afraid to acknowledge that. And there's also a lot of stereotypes around youth pastors that, you know, they're lazy or they don't work hard or they're just goofing around or they play games all day or
We just go to the beach with our students for fun.
Exactly. Or like kid, you know, like we joked about it, but like kids ministry, they're focused and professional, but you know, youth is like whatever. It's just not true.
Yeah. No.
Like, and I know it's not true because I've lived in that space. And sure, do we have fun? Yeah. Did we play probably too much ping pong in the office? 100%.
Oh yeah.
But did we also carry the emotional and mental load of our ministry and the people involved and you know the things that students were going through 100%? And that the way that impacts your soul is dynamic. In fact, a church that I was a part of in Arizona went through some really difficult things. Our former lead pastor years ago, there was a major moral failure. It was a big deal. I led them through the next 7 years of that church as everything was changing and turning around, youth ministry and all of that. I remember the new lead pastor at one point talking about how the youth ministry was probably the healthiest thing in the church as a whole, which I felt really proud
That's great.
of.
That is amazing.
But at what cost?
Yeah.
Because here's
Yes.
the other thing I recognize, and I'm going to say this, and we may have to cut this out. We'll see. Orange has been going through some really difficult things.
Yes.
And one of the things that I said at the very beginning when we hit this was, having lived through difficult things in an organization before, what I won't do again is sacrifice my family and my own mental and spiritual health on behalf of this work that I do.
Yeah.
Because I look back at those years and go, gosh, I was crushing as a youth pastor. But if I'm really honest, I'm missing a lot of memories with my oldest two sons from that time in their life, in their early years. And now, you know, they're a little bit older and we have two more that are in those same ages. And I look and I go, I'm not going to do it again. I'm not going to do it.
Yep.
Because I don't think that's what Jesus want me to do. I don't think that that's my responsibility.
Right.
I actually think the Holy Spirit is a lot more powerful than I am. And when I live
That's
like
an
those
amen
things
moment.
aren't
Yeah.
true, when I live like those things aren't true,
Yes.
I am actually living counter to everything that I'm preaching and teaching and believe at the core of who I am. So some of that, and I'll get off this soapbox, but some of that is the pressure of youth ministry, which is unique. It's my own lived experience, but there's something else you said that stuck out to me, which is the awareness of all of that has been a gift of my early 30s. Because as a 20-something youth pastor, one, nobody was really saying that to me, or they were saying it, but they weren't following it up or necessarily
that makes
exemplifying
sense.
it.
Yeah.
But now I look and I'm like, I love silence and solitude. It's not the easiest thing, but I crave it now. Like, spiritual practice is infused, but this is a disclaimer. If you embrace all of these things that we're talking about, there is also a chance that your perspective of what ministry success is will change.
Oh, 1,000%.
And that is
It's going to be
tough.
scary.
It is. It's scary. Like, that's just a lot. I don't know if we want to talk about that or not, but I don't even know where I was going with that. I just felt like I needed to share it with somebody.
But
And
when,
people won't like that it's changing either.
No.
right.
no.
Yeah. And that shift, how does your senior leadership feel about
Exactly.
that shift?
Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough. Like, but I don't know. I've just come to this place where I'm like, but the health of your soul is most important. Sure, you can get a lot of students to show up at a thing, but your family falls apart.
Yes.
You fall apart.
Yes.
Or to the point you were making earlier, you're only, I can't remember who said this, but you're only be able to lead them to the place where you currently are, or where you've been, or to your own place of spiritual formation. So if that's lacking, then what are you leading students to in the long run?
So good.
Absolutely. And I think too, when the focus is so much on your production, the assumption becomes that you are responsible for their souls and for their relationship with God.
Wow.
And so I think that's another reason why it needs to be said very clearly out loud to the people that need to hear it, that we are invited to co-labor with God.
Wow.
Right?
Yes.
That's good.
And that because we are not the creator, that we do have boundaries and we do have limitations.
Oh, that's good.
And so where are our limitations and where is our invitation to step back so that there is space for God to do God's work?
And the crazy thing is I've gotten to the place where I'm always going, I think I can make my boundaries more firm. I think I can make my boundaries more strong. And it's taking me, I'm not 30 yet, but I wish that I'd gotten to this. I know. Sorry, listeners.
Well, I'm not over the
sorry,
hill yet,
Shane,
you
you're
know?
so
Whatever,
old.
just
But
saying.
I wish that I had heard this when I was 20 in ministry.
Yep.
Yes.
Because I'm in this for the longevity of, I do not want to be, I want to be at this place in my life looking down the road where the seeds that I'm planting with the people in my life that God has positioned me to be around, I want to be able to look back and go, I'm here with these people on purpose because God has planted me here for a purpose. And so I want to be able to be present with them and not burnt out because I'd wasted so much of my early years striving for something that I could not even produce because I was never meant to carry the things that I was carrying.
Yeah, right.
Oh, Jenny, come
Yeah.
on.
I'm sorry.
We've got to learn how to limit ourselves within boundaries and within reasons so that we can be here for the longevity that God has called us to be here for.
Right.
That is key. That word longevity is massively important in youth ministry.
Yes.
We talk all the time. It's not a stepping stone to something else. And unfortunately, there's only a handful of, Katie Edwards in the world
I know
who did
that.
this
Yes.
for decades.
Yep.
And people who, if you don't know Katie, she's amazing. She's in California.
wonderful.
She's campus pastor now. That's recent though. She was in youth ministry for years and years, and somebody that I look up to a ton. But that longevity comes from a place of health, and that's the focus. So much of what we celebrate in the church, I'll say again, the church in America specifically, are these flash in a pan leaders and ministries. They have these really strong 3 years where thousands of kids show up. And I'm not trying to just like shrug all that off or say it doesn't matter. Please don't hear that. But where we need more Katies. We need more decades long youth workers who have the foundation and the health of their soul in a place that can sustain them for the long term. I long for that day. I long in 40 years to look back and see, people like you all, people like you, Jenny, and Ryan, who go, you know what? I mean, if the Lord leads you to something different, that's the thing. But if you're in this, I'm like, gosh, like that's what I think the next generation needs as well.
So soak it up, Ryan. Soak up this place of just being able to rest and pray and have this sabbatical, because that is such a gift that is so nice. I'm so grateful that you've been given such a gift.
Yeah.
Well, a quote that came to mind from Rich Velotis that I think is important. He says that illusion is the only place that God does not dwell, for God dwells in reality. And I think a really good step in the new year to move from a place of unhealth into health is to just start by naming the illusions that we're hiding in. What are we pretending? What are we numbing? What are we avoiding? What are we denying? We feel it, our body feels the weight of that unhealth, but how can we actually pull God's kingdom and reality into those places that we're just not letting God into? And I think that's a really bold and vulnerable and courageous prayer that God will really honor.
Yeah, exactly. I might also even kind of take it further or push back a little to say that those places where we are vulnerable and hurting, those are the places that God already is. And so when we can be brave enough to create space for those, we recognize that God's been there all along, and we can then lean into whatever it is that God is trying to offer us there.
That's so good. Could you, you said something that I'm curious about. I'd love to hear you talk more on, which is limits. The reason why at my church this past Sunday, our pastor talked about limits and boundaries. I know you mentioned Rich Velotis, Ryan, but I know Pete Scazzaro, or the Scuzz as I call him. Nobody calls him that.
I was who calls him
nobody
that?
does, but I do. He talks about limits and embracing limits. Would you, that's new. I don't, growing up in the context that I did, and even pastoring, you know, in the churches that I did, non-denom, larger churches, I didn't hear a whole lot about limits, but I think even if you're in those contexts and you can celebrate those, this can be so helpful. Would you just riff on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I work with a lot of clergy, and so I think what you're speaking to is so real. I think clergy and pastoral staff are just expected to be limitless. I mean, it's like you're representing God, and God is limitless, so you should be too, you know?
Wow.
Like if you're doing this right.
Yeah, goodness sake.
Yeah.
That's real.
And so I think there is a lot of just humility and honesty and health in acknowledging, no, I have limits. I am a created being. I am not the creator.
Yes.
And so I need to be, in order to be here for you, and in order to be able to help you hear God in you, I need to acknowledge my own limits and honor my own limits, because that allows me to hear God within me.
Yeah, that's good.
I think is what I would say. That's really
What are some examples of limits?
What are some examples of limits? You know, I think certainly it's about just energy, the amount of energy that you have, the amount of time that you have, the amount of ideas that you have.
Wow.
Yeah, and even maybe the amount of understanding that you have about God. I'm working on a podcast with another friend on just questions and how we hold questions. And what we've been talking about is how important it is to say, I don't know.
Yes. Yes.
And we don't know.
That's so good.
I mean, particularly because we serve God, who is capital M mystery.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and God cannot be fully known.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe part of the limits is just saying sometimes, I don't know. And so maybe you and I can sit together in the not knowing, trusting that the Spirit is here with us.
Oh, that's good.
That's so good.
Yeah, that is really good.
I feel like you have to talk about Sabbath if you talk about limits, because again, like Sabbath, it's not just sabbatical, but a weekly rhythm that you can incorporate. And like the beauty of acknowledging your limits and practicing Sabbath is that you're actually like teaching yourself that I am not what I do. I'm not my performance. I'm not the sum of my greatest achievement or my worst mistake, but like at my core, I am God's beloved. And like I can't do everything, and that's okay, because that's not who I am. And so like to me, when you acknowledge your limits, that's where you come to understand like your enoughness in God more than anything else.
I love what you're saying, Ryan. But as someone who coaches pastors for a living, I would say that most people, if you took their ministry away, they would flounder and say, who am I?
Yeah.
Like what is left?
That's true.
Yes.
Right? They wouldn't have an identity outside of their ministry.
Yeah.
And I find that so often in the people that I coach, because all that they are is wrapped up in what they do, instead of understanding a calling versus the job.
Yeah.
100%.
So as we kind of wrap up this conversation, I am a highly practical person. Like I need nuts and bolts. I would love to hear kind of your last thoughts on how do we implement some spiritual practices as uber busy people who are loving students and leading families. How do we care for ourselves in a really deep, practical way?
Oh, so many things, but maybe a hot take, and it's so simple too. Stop taking every cultural holiday and event and creating a youth group event around it and for it.
Say it louder for the people in the back, Ryan. Say it a little louder.
Yes.
Cut back your
That's
calendar.
funny.
Because like when I was in my early 20s, I felt like I had to create a youth event for everything that was on the cultural calendar. And what that led to was me not having a social life with my friends. Like I didn't know what it looked like to have a Super Bowl party with my friends. I didn't know what New Year's Eve looked like with my friends, or just all of those things. So like set the example and model like relational priority. Give that time to students and their families, because Orange,
Yes.
hello, like what an opportunity. Yeah, and just be more intentional with the events that you create, and do fun things for yourself. Prioritize your spouse if you're married. If you're single, prioritize your friends. Those are your relational
Yes.
priorities. Family. Amen.
That's good.
Amen.
Jenny?
I would say, what are some daily practices that you can do?
Yeah.
So like, don't wait until your weekend, whether it's Friday and Saturday or whether you take Monday off. Don't wait for your quote unquote day off. Like, what are some daily habits that you can get into and start small?
Yep.
Like, put your phone aside at 10 p.m. Stop scrolling social media. Don't put in your passcode to get past your time limit on social media. I know we all do it, right?
Yep.
Just what are some daily habits that you can get into to help you get past some of those things, and enjoy just being present in the ordinary and the mundane,
Yep.
and really practice that mindfulness. Maybe it's breathing, maybe it's walking around the block,
Yeah.
maybe it's picking up a book and reading it,
Yep.
or maybe it's listening to more podcasts that aren't about ministry.
Yes.
So
right.
just finding something simple and starting small.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be big.
That's good. Ryan mentioned earlier, finding rest, silence, and solitude even in a city. I want to find a parallel there with a large church. I want to talk to large church leaders for a second. I think this applies to all context, but having that as my background and also, still obviously having a lot of friends in that space, I would say when your church is large, it can be really difficult to slow down.
Yeah.
And find space without the noise, because there's always dozens more small group leaders to find. There's always parents who are emailing and calling.
Yep.
There's staff and, cross-departmental relationships to maintain. Your lead pastor always has there's a lot there. And I know this exists everywhere, but just hear me. There's something unique in this context that you can almost excuse, like you were saying earlier, you can excuse healthy soul for the productive results.
Yeah.
And I would just say you have to work to reject that, and your ministry will be healthier, you will be healthier, your family will be healthier, your friend relationships will be healthier, and all of it kind of comes together for me really practical with this idea that I've identified a symptom of when I'm in that space versus when I'm not. I want to read something to you. I use this app called like TO365. It's such an incredible app. But there was this quote from theologian Thomas Dubay. He describes something called infused prayer, and he describes it this way. One finds that a loving attention to God is simply present without the recipient's activity or effort. Often it takes the form of a given or infused desire for God. It is not a loving attention or yearning that results from a reasoning process, because this communion is a gift. It is called infused. The reason why I bring this up is I would say in the seasons of my life where I've been healthiest spiritually, that has been a part of my journey. This infused prayer, this desire, this longing for God in even unexpected moments will appear. And when I go enough time not having that type of experience, it's an indicator to me that I need to slow down, or something's out of rhythm, or my practices have kind of gone to the wayside, or I'm just so consumed with production and producing more and creating more that I'm missing out on the rich experience of God and His presence. So that would be my encouragement. I would say, like, reject that regardless of your context, and be aware of your signs and symptoms that may be indicating that you need to do some deep work.
That's good.
That's good.
All right, Kristen, as our resident spiritual director today, what are a couple practical things that all the youth workers listening and volunteers listening could do to protect their spiritual health?
Yeah, so I love all of what each of you has shared, because each of you, I think, is really offering invitations to just keep it simple and to really sort of pay attention. And so I want to kind of build on that. I've been recently sort of really leaning in. I've been sort of captivated with this phrase, lean in, this idea of leaning in, because I think that's that's a lot of the invitation for us when we are dealing with mystery, is just to kind of lean in and, to the, I don't know. But I think where it applies to our spiritual practices, I would say in two ways. One is to recognize any resistance that you have. Anytime that you are recognizing that there's a resistance to setting boundaries, and turning off the phone, or there's a resistance to silence and solitude, or to whatever it is, if you can just notice the resistance, and be curious about what's behind that, what's below the surface, and kind of lean into that.
Yep.
And then the other place that I would say to lean in is to lean into love, to just recognize that God is love, and that we are deeply loved, and love is always here and always available to us. And so just whenever you can, when you're sitting at a stoplight or walking the dog or whatever, just take a minute to just kind of lean into that love.
That's beautiful.
That's good. I love
That's
that.
really good.
I love the simplicity of all the things that we've talked about, because it feels so hard. And the reality is, caring for your spiritual health doesn't have to be rocket science, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But it is carving out time, having limits, setting boundaries. And maybe just taking a deep breath here and there.
It's
I
good.
love that.
Breathing.
Yes.
That's good.
It's good.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I know this is a really important conversation, because we want you to be in ministry for the long haul.
Yep.
We want you to care for students. We want you to love families. And we just want you to be healthy, friends. Thank you for listening to the Rethinking Youth Ministry podcast. We are so curious about what you are rethinking in ministry. So DM us at Orange Students. Until next time.